important with cheesecakes is that everything is at room temperature. That way you avoid having any lumps and just mixes very well together. If it is cold, you can always microwave it, or if you have enough time to plan ahead, just leave it out at room temp for about an hour or two, just so it softens up. So, in the recipe, you can just get like the standard blocks of cream cheese. It's 8 ounces, so it's gonna be 2.5 blocks for this recipe. I can go straight into the mixer. And just kind of give it a few folds with the spatula, make sure it's nice and soft, no lumps in there. Then you're going to add the sugar. I did make one small change to the original recipe. I added a teaspoon of cornstarch to this. What that'll help do is just firm it up more. It's almost like a fail-safe. Depending on your home oven, what the settings are. Each oven's a little bit different. Even the ones that I use in the restaurants, there's always a discrepancy in the heat. So a little bit of cornstarch just helps it so that it'll firm up evenly and keep together. So the sugar, that 1 teaspoon of cornstarch, and the cream cheese go into the mixer. I use the paddle attachment. If you have a hand mixer, just a regular beater attachment works. Or if you're mixing this by hand, I would suggest just paddling it with a rubber spatula. So that's just going to mix until it comes together and is nice and smooth. A lot of times people ask me how much time is it going to be on the mixer. It's just up to the machine and when it's done. So just keep an eye on it. About halfway through, you want to stop, scrape down the bowl, and again, this is all to prevent any lumps. So turn it on itself a few times. Scrape down the attachment here. Any questions so far? All good? It's been a while since I've done a demonstration. I've actually, pre-COVID let's call it, I would do about 2 or 3 a year just for like different events or fundraisers or things, so I'm a little out of practice right now. If anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, let me know. Always fun to hear what the audience has to add in or say. Alright, so that's the timer for the crust. Just get the... Yeah. Nice. So, the best way to check is you just want the edges here, just where it meets the pan, have just a tiny bit of color. So it'll look just a little bit darker, more of a dark golden brown, we call it. This will just set aside until it cools. Alright, so the batter, still about another 20 seconds of mixing, should be ready for the next step. You don't want to whip this either. If you whip it too much, you'll add a lot of air into the batter.
One question?
Yes.
Do you weigh down your crust to make it even?
No, sorry, the timer for that one's going on. Thank you. For this type of crust, you don't need to weigh it down. If you're making a dough crust for maybe a tart, if you're using a pâte sablée, it's like a sugar cookie dough for like a fruit tart or something, I would recommend weighing it down. But for a graham cracker crust, because there's nothing making it rise, there's no baking powder, soda, or yeast in it, there's no need to. As long as you press it down pretty firmly, either by hand or you can use the bottom of like a flat bottomed cup or something, that'll be enough. Aroma tomatoes, they just have less liquid. But these are pretty nice and firm, so they should be pretty good. So different ways you can chop this. You can cut it top to bottom, I guess. So this one you can give it a fine dice, so roughly 1/4 inch. Everything in Taboule I like to have the same size, so I'm going to try to shoot for about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch dice. Position what's comfortable for you in the middle, and again, use the finger to guide it. Tomatoes are notorious for like moving around when you're dicing, so it doesn't have to be perfect. But and depending on how sharp your knives are at home, tomatoes you may need to use a serrated knife for it. I guess you make that call. It's a nice dice here that we can set off to the side. I don't know if any of you do any gardening, but definitely a good recipe to use up all your tomatoes. All the ingredients and the amounts that I gave you guys in the packet, you can definitely change to your taste. If you have a lot of tomatoes coming in from the garden right now, I know it's August and everyone's kind of finishing up the gardening season, or at least up here in Boston, the tomatoes are kind of coming to an end. Bump it up, use 2 or 3 in there if you want. So this will show you a different way. You can just slice it lengthwise like that. And just make sure that your knives are really sharp. I know some people maybe have an aversion to sharpening their knives because they kind of fear cutting themselves, but it's kind of counterintuitive. The sharper your knife is, the less of a risk there is of you cutting yourself, because the sharper it is, the easier it's going to do what you want to do, and there's less of a risk of it slipping out of the way, pushing the food out of the way because it can't cut, and then slipping and cutting your finger.
It is 1:15, just time check.
Okay. So 1:15. So now, all the tomatoes. see. So tabboule, I always like to make far in advance, at least a few hours before you eat it. That way, once you dress it up, all the flavors can mix together. It tastes really good. So the cucumber, just cut the ends off. I don't think we'll be using the whole thing, about a half of this cucumber, depending on what type you get in the store. This is just a regular one. One should be fine. So for something that's round and you want to cut into cubes, first square it off. That way it won't roll around. So now you can slice it. And again, we're going for the 1/4 inch slices. There we go. This is ready. Scrape it down one more time. Next, we're going to add the eggs. So it's 2 whole eggs, 1 yolk, and I also put in the vanilla at this point. So this you just slowly put in one egg at a time. So before you put in the last egg, stop mixing and then give it another scrape. That all depends on what I'm making. So in a case like this where I'm already going to be adding like the blueberry topping to it, the sauce, and there's also a little bit of zest in there, I would just use the extract. It's less expensive and there really is no need because there's so many different flavors involved. If it's something that you're showcasing vanilla itself and want to have like the natural speckle look of vanilla beans, I would definitely say splurge and get the beans. I just know from working at the restaurant, the price of vanilla beans has skyrocketed, so I'd say just go with the extract. Something like a creme brulee, I would definitely recommend the beans over the extract because that you're showcasing the vanilla flavor in the custard. Well, I wish I could pass out samples, but it's not good. Well, you can. That's actually what I do at work. So I'll use the vanilla bean. You know, if you haven't worked with it, you cut it lengthwise down the middle. You scrape out the seeds that are inside, and then the shell itself I'll set aside. Actually, use it 2 ways. So you can use the vanilla bean, the shell, and just mix it with sugar, let it sit for a few weeks, and that creates vanilla sugar. And you can use that sugar just as you would normal sugar in baking, and that'll give the flavor of vanilla. Or you can put it in a bottle, like a canning jar, and fill it to the top with just a regular vodka, unflavored vodka, or just a pure alcohol, and let it sit cool, dry place out of the sun for about a month, and you'll have yourself vanilla extract. So the eggs are all added in. Next we're going to add the heavy cream and the sour cream, which I've already scaled up in one container. And that can just go in there at once. Honestly, can't remember the last time I made such a small batch of anything. Everything at the restaurant is in gallons and giant portions of like 15 cheesecakes. Kind of nice. Okay, so now once it's all combined, I'll just give it a quick scrape of the palette one more time, and this is ready to bake. So, pretty straightforward and easy. Actually, I forgot the last ingredient, the lemon zest. I always like to add lemon to custards like this. It just gives a little added brightness to the flavor. So for that, you don't need to add too much. This is a microplane. If you have a box grater, that'll work as well, but just make sure you don't zest too deep into the lemon and get the pith, the white peel. You just want to get the yellow outer skin, which has all the essential oils that gives you the lemon flavor. So it's about a half teaspoon worth. And that you can just fold them by hand. So at this point, a nice squared off cucumber. Oop. It's slippery. I'll take care of that later. So in French, there's a lot of different terms for the knife cuts. 1/4 inch stick like this, it's a brunoise, and then once you cut it, you can dice the brunoise and become the 1/4 inch dice. And I think the most common one people have heard of is the julienne. That's an 1/8 of an inch, 3 inch by 3 inch long stick, and that's used more of a garnish on a lot of things. Even it out a little bit easier, and you can just dice it. Nice fine dice here. And I won't go into too much of all the French terms for this, but
that could be another class.
we can incorporate that in. It's a lot to just take in different French terms right now for just dicing.
You don't waste any of the food.
You don't need to use the skins of the cucumber. It does add a little bit of a bitterness to it, but since we're going to be having the salt and the acid from the lemon juice, and there's going to be the olive oil, a little bit of that bitterness will kind of balance out all the flavors. Alright, and finally the green onion. Just organize here a little bit. Don't need too much. See, for that amount, maybe 4 or 5 sprigs. Cut the roots off. Yes. Yeah. It depends on the produce. These tomatoes were pretty firm, so I didn't take out the seeds. The cucumber, it's also, the seeds are very, very small. If you do notice that it's a bit more ripe of a cucumber and the seeds are larger, you can always scoop them out. But this one, they're almost minuscule. Again, a lot of these things are kind of more personal preference. The green onions, so I just cut off the roots. I'm going to cut it on the side, on the bias. And again, so if you can see, so onions on the side, that just gives it a nice little shape, just so it looks a little bit different in the bowl. And again, the thumb is in the back, and the other fingers are helping to guide the knife. And I'd say until you get used to chopping, if you're not already, don't already have the practice, I definitely go slow. Things like this. These we can compost. Alright. All the vegetables are chopped, and I think we're right on time. 1:21, perfect. So, and then the bulgur wheat. That's going to go on top. Alright, so I do like this so that all the flavoring goes on the bulgur, and then once you toss it, that'll help spread it all throughout the salad because it's a little bit, it's just moist. So. The bulgur wheat. Yeah, so bulgur wheat, it's the whole kernels of wheat that are first cooked, and then they're dried and then ground up. All of that process is already done at like a food processing plant. I know old school, in my family in Armenia, that's something that the families would do once a year. They would collect and harvest the wheat, they'd cook it, grind it, and they'd sift it into the different portions. But here in the US, you can just go to the store and buy it. If you can't find bulgur wheat at the store, you can cook quinoa. And a little bit of extra from the other one I had made, so I'll add that into here too. So that I'm going to pour into the pan. This is already cooled down a little bit. You never want to pour it in hot because the crust will still be soft, and you just risk pushing the crust out of the way and kind of mixing up the different layers. Alright, so this you can just pour in. Yes. Years of practice. You saw my bedroom, it's a mess, but my kitchen is usually pretty clean. I don't know what my girlfriend would say about that. She always complains. Just kidding. Alright. So, this does take a while to bake. You can always put it in a water bath and bump up the temperature, but then you risk, browning the top or having it crack while it's baking. So this I'll put in, depending on your oven, if it runs hot or cooler, you need to kind of adjust. But I do it at 225 with convection. If your oven is not able to do convection at that low of a temperature, you can bake it between 225 and 250. Yes, I just cooled it. It was just a little bit warmer than room temperature. It's such a thin pan and thin crust that it cools down pretty quickly. You just don't want it to be, straight out of the oven at 375 that we baked it at. And it firms up pretty quick. So this is the one that I had made a little bit earlier. If you can see, let me know if you can see from there, but it has like a nice jiggle to it. It's pretty firm if you touch it. A lot of times to check if a custard is done, it's kind of a very old school way of checking it, but if you shake it, you want the jiggle to go back and forth instead of inward and out like a ring of water. Like if you were to throw a pebble into a pond and makes the rings that go out, if the cheesecake or the batter is doing that, it means that it's still liquid. But if you're shaking it and it moves as a single mass back and forth, that means it's set all the way through. Is there a question? It just makes it easier. It's not a necessity. If you don't have one of the springform pans, what you can do is, if you're using a regular 8-inch round cake pan, make sure you spray it well, or just use some vegetable oil. Cut a round of parchment paper to fit inside the pan, and put that down before you put in the crust, and then build the layers off of that. If you go that route, make sure that once you do remove it from the oven, you cool it down completely and then refrigerate it before you pop it out of the pan, because the crust and everything needs to be completely cooled down. If it does stick to the pan, I would recommend, once it's chilled completely, warm the bottom of the pan over the stove just for a few seconds, and that'll help release the oil from the parchment. Right, so this cheesecake is now all set. I'm going to let that cool, and we'll move on to the taboule. Before we move on to that, I'm going to do the blueberry topping. Almost forgot that part. So blueberry topping, it's going to be a 1/4 cup of water, 1/4 cup of sugar, and then you're going to just adjust the taste with lemon juice and the zest from the lemon. And then about 1 to 1 1/4 cup of blueberries. You're just going to cook it down until it makes a nice like blueberry syrup almost. So I do have some here ready. I cooked it, if you can see. It'll hold on to the spoon, so it's nice and thick. Just regular with water, a little bit of salt, drain it, let it cool down, and then use it in place 1 to 1 for the bulgur bean. So I put in a little bit of salt, just a little bit of black pepper. This is called Aleppo red pepper. It's just a type of Middle Eastern ground red pepper flake. It's not as hot as a cayenne pepper, but it's not as mild as a paprika. So you can, if you can't find this, you can use just a little bit of crushed chili flakes if you want a little bit of heat, or just a smoked paprika, and that should be about the equivalent. But I like a good amount of heat in my food too, so I'll put a little bit extra. What's that?
So do I.
Yeah, so does Ani. She loves spicy food. So this last spice is sumac. It's a berry that comes from a wild tree. In the U.S., if you've ever gone, driving down the highway during the fall time, there's trees that kind of grow wild on the sides. They're really long leaves, and it's very random. But those wild trees that here we find as like a noxious weed almost, in a lot of the Mediterranean countries, they collect the berries from that and they'll dry it and then grind it, and it adds a little bit of like an acidic bite to the dish. Kind of a hard flavor to describe. It's a little bit earthy, a little bit acidic, a little bit of bitterness, but it kind of pulls the whole dish together. Alright, so once all that is in there, I'll add a little bit more salt. Put a good amount of olive oil, I'd say about a 1/4 cup. More, and about 1/4 cup of lemon juice. Alright, so then this, pull this out of the way. Yeah, could you grab me a spoon? Toss it. Thank you. So quick wipe down. So any questions so far? give it a nice mix. Bring everything from the bottom up top. I also don't like taking the seeds out from the tomatoes if I don't need to, because that adds a little bit more liquid to the dish too. And a few hours after making this, that's when the flavor really comes together and just helps spread all the seasoning throughout. So typically
Please taste the food
Yes.
for us.
I'd say serve this chilled. Keep in the fridge until you're going to eat it. I like it served and garnished with the romaine leaves, like the heart of the romaine. Take the small sleeves and you can kind of put it along the side, and those you can even use as scoops. So you can, yeah.
They want you to try the.
They want me to try it.
Honey, you do it.
Me.
No, I'll have Ani taste. She can tell me if I'm missing anything. Alright, so if you can see here, this firmed up nicely too. It's more of a jam now.
Do you want me to taste it?
Yeah.
I'll do the taste test. It's really, really good. I wish I could share this with you all.
Doesn't hear anything?
Nothing.
Can everyone hear her?
Can you hear me?
Okay. Speaking to the right here.
Delicious.
Nice.
I'll add this to the dishes later on.
That's Taboule. The cheesecake that I took out, it's still a little bit warm. Might be difficult to pop it out. I'll give it a shot. Nice and cool down. So this you can always make ahead and keep in the fridge. It'll last about a week, as long as it's covered and the air is sealed out. Alright. So we'll start with blueberries. So you want to put about 3/4 of a cup of the blueberries in the pan, and then that you'll add the water to. That can go in. And the sugar. I did save some of the blueberries here. That gets folded in after, just so you have some fresh blueberries mixed in with the cooked blueberry. Just the flavor is very different, a fresh blueberry from a cooked blueberry, and also the texture is very different. So you have a little bit of both, and just looks a lot nicer once it's put onto the cheesecake. How are we doing on time?
It's 12:50, so you're right on.
Perfect. Also, for the cream cheese, and this is not a product placement, I'm not getting paid by them or anything, just throwing that out there, but I do prefer Philadelphia brand. I've just noticed from the store brands or other like knockoff brands, they don't bake as well. That one brand of cream cheese always tends, it's kind of like the golden standard in my kitchen, just because it doesn't crack when you end up baking the cheesecake. If any of you have another brand that you recommend or if you've used, please let me know, because it is great, but it is expensive. So. You could also possibly use Neufchâtel cheese, which is a French style of cream cheese. It may bake slightly different, but that also is a pretty good substitute, and it's not as high in calories as regular cream cheese. So if you want to try that, you can. So the blueberries you want to cook on high heat with the sugar and the water, and that'll cause the skins to burst and the color will start to mix into the liquid from the berries. And once it starts to thicken, then you can lower the heat and simmer it down. So while that's going, I'm going to start on chopping for the taboule. So, what I have here, all the ingredients here. I already soaked the bulgur wheat here. So they sell different coarseness, different sizes of bulgur wheat. I use the finest one. It may say extra fine on the packaging or number 1. So that's the one I use. And I soaked it in a bit of water. So it's 1 cup of bulgur wheat. You soak it in cool water, and that took up all of it. If there's any extra water left, you can always drain it out using a fine sieve. This is starting to boil now, as you can see there. It's still very watery, but the color is starting to come off.
Tomatoes are from my garden.
I brought this.
Oh.
So I have some washed parsley here. I used about 2 bunches. I know a bunch isn't really a specific unit of measure, but it was about an inch wide bunch of stems. And again, it kind of all depends on what ratio you want your bulgur wheat to the parsley. I'm using curly leaf parsley for this one. You can use flat leaf Italian parsley. I just like the curly leaf. When you chop it, it still stays a bit springy and it doesn't flatten together like the flat leaves do in the bowl. Okay, so this is starting to get a little bit thicker. Alright, so what you can do to help you pop these out is just, this is an offset spatula, it's called, small offset spatula. Probably one of the most used tools in my pastry toolkit.
Just
run it along the edge.
Cable to Mom's iPad. Cable that goes to her iPad.
And this one did crack a little bit, but
Inside, plugged in. I need that cable. Otherwise.
There we go. So, here's the cheesecake. Honey, could you get me a like a cake pedestal or something, so I can display this?
Yes. What do you need?
Like a display for the
Oh,
cheesecake.
yes.
So if your cheesecake cracks like this one did, it's most likely because it did cook a little bit too long. And unfortunately, the difference can be as small as 5 minutes. So just keep an eye on it. If second it's set in the oven and it shakes and doesn't look too liquidy, take it out of the oven and cool it down. But should still be good. So any questions so far once I get the platter, I can plate this up and dress it with the jam. I do want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy day to spend a little bit of time here in our kitchen. Very Christmassy.
Sounds like
So I'll just dress this up now. Thank you. Great, I do too. And if you do have any questions after this, or if you would ever like to reach me, on Instagram I am, whole shameless plug here, but you can reach me it's at Boston Pastry Chef. So if you do have any questions or comments, tips, or if you ever just want any sort of kitchen know-how, hit me up there. I am kind of ramping that up slowly. I do have a lot of cakes that I still need to post, but it's always nice to kind of hear feedback from people that aren't in the industry. Sometimes I just kind of get surrounded with so many people that their life is the food industry that I don't know what normal people that don't cook every single day for a living think. So follow me at Boston Pastry Chef on Instagram. Love to hear from you. So here's a cheesecake. I'm gonna let it cool a little bit more before we cut into it. But thank you again. Thank you so much.
everybody. And as I mentioned in the chat, we will be sending out a survey. I'll send you the email. Just some feedback on what you liked, what you would like to see improved, and then any other, ideas for the hopefully next cooking class. But we will take some pictures and share them with everybody. And then, as Langton mentioned, he has that Boston Pastry Chef on Instagram. He has different, cakes and birthday cakes and cupcakes and all different things, and even normal food he makes too, so not just pastry. So feel free to check him out. But thanks everybody again, and I wish I could describe how amazing it was. Sure you all can see and imagine,
It smells great.
It smells great, it tastes great, and I hope you all can replicate it at home. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Any type of fruit compo like this, you want to work with a much taller pot than you need because it will start to bubble up. Originally it was maybe an inch off the pan, but it's boiling at almost the top right now. Anything with fruits cooking down with sugar, always give it as much space as possible. Okay. So we'll start the taboule. A little bit on using knives and knife cuts. If you don't already know, this is a knife steel. This is not used to sharpen a blade. This is used to hone a blade. So to sharpen it, I have a grinder. I won't bring it out now, it's just obnoxiously loud. But you grind it down. This is used to just put the final edge on the blade, or in between sharpenings before you use a knife. Just give it a quick few runs on the steel. Not to get all scientific, but what it does is it puts like a micro finish on the blade. Any rough little notches that are left from the coarse grinding wheel, or if you have a sharpening stone, this will even it out so you get a nice finished edge. I use just a regular chef knife. This is a Santoku style knife. It's a more Japanese version of a chef knife. And which has a little curve to it. I just prefer it because it has a natural rocking motion once you cut it. Alright, so this is thickening up pretty nice. cheesecakes can probably take around 45 minutes to an hour to bake. I'd say about half an hour in, check the cheesecake, give it a turn. It's always good to rotate the pans in the oven just so if there are any hot spots that'll take care of that. So let's start with the parsley. That's going to take the longest. You could use a food processor to do this if the blades are nice and sharp. If they're not, all you're going to be doing is mashing it together and just make a mess. So I just prefer doing it all by hand. It does take a little bit longer. So when you're cutting anything, you need to be mindful of your fingers. My girlfriend Ani is laughing behind the camera right now because when she ever picks up a knife, I get all nervous. I'm still trying to teach her the knife skills. Okay, I'm gonna put this on low and just let it cook for 1 or 2 more minutes and that should be set. So whenever you're cutting, you have 5 fingers on your hand. You want to keep all of them there and nowhere else on the cutting board. Always keep the thumb in the back. Use outlier, but you need to protect it too. So the thumb is used to push whatever ingredient you're using into the blade. That'll keep the force into the blade. The rest of the fingers are used to guide the blade straight down. So if you're holding your hand straight out like this, you want to give the fingertips just a slight curl inward. You're not talking anything like this, it's just a slight inward curl so that when the blade goes down, you don't hit your fingernails. There's always a little bit of a gap. So thumb in the back, 4 fingers in the front, creating a flat edge, slightly curled in, and you're just cutting. And the thumb is kind of guiding the ingredients in. It's tough to show it with the parsley because there's so many individual little pieces, but you'll get the idea when I cut the cucumber. Put the heel of your hand on the edge of the knife here, and then you can hold the other side of the knife with your dominant hand. Again, keep all the fingers out of the way of the blade. Any questions so far? I'm just curious, how many people are cooking along with me right now and how many people are just enjoying the watch? It's a lot to take off the lunch break to make a cheesecake and some stuff. I'm just lucky I had a day off today, so.
Someone said watching because I will not be able to match up with the chef's speed. And someone else says mesmerized by your chopping skills. You're very lucky.
It just takes a lot of practice. I mean, my knife skills aren't bad. Some chefs that I work with, they can do like all that stuff. Alright, so that's the first one. This can all go there. I would recommend, or highly recommend, not to use dried, just because you won't get the same flavor. There are different types of tabbouleh. I prefer the one that's heavier on the fresh parsley. There are other types. People from different regions of the Middle East or the Mediterranean, they'll make where it's heavier on the bulgur wheat or the quinoa or whatever the grain is. Those ones I think you could get away with using the dry parsley. I just don't think the flavor is the same.
As someone who watched countless hours of food TV, your chopping skills are great.
Thank you. So just a little more information on knives. I know some people like to have lots of gadgets in their kitchen. I prefer not to. I just prefer having a single chef knife and a paring knife. And I would say anything other than that, I would say a bread knife. And if you do fillet fish or cut any sort of meats like that in home for cooking, I would say maybe a fillet knife. Other than that, I think everything else is just extra stuff to clutter your cabinet space. As to the size of the knife, it all depends on the size of your hand. It's always good if you want to invest in a nice knife to go hold it. I know some stores, if it's like a nice cooking store, they'll actually allow you to chop a few things and kind of get a feel for it. But also you don't need to invest a lot of money into it. I think this one, my family, we've had this knife for 10-15 years now, and it was maybe $30. I think we got it at like a Target or something. I don't even know the brand, but it's a great knife, and it's a lot better than some much more expensive knives that I've tried.
Cheesecake in the oven.
Oh, that definitely. I would say have steak knives too, but I'm just talking about cooking knives. Also, like steak knives are good, obviously, like the butter knife too. But I know they have like there's like the butcher knife. There's a tourneing knife, which is kind of like an eagle claw looking knife. There's the mini chef knife, the long chef knife. They have like 100 different variations. I mean, unless you're looking to cut through bone like you're slaughtering an animal, there's really no reason to have a giant cleaver in your kitchen. Not necessarily. I would say stick to anything like a high carbon steel is good, or really like a quality stainless steel knife is good. I would not necessarily the brand, but just the make of the knife. This is called the tang, which is the metal that connects the blade to the handle. You should have a knife that's a full tang, it's called. If you can see, I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but it goes all the way through to the end of the handle. This is the most secure type and most balanced knife. That's the center point right there. You can balance it right in the middle. So the blade and the handle should weigh the same so that you can balance it right where they meet.
This is cheesecake in the oven.
Yeah, cheesecake's in the oven. That has quite a bit to go. Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Did you change anything in the recipe, or did you go exactly by what was in the pack? So I pulled this off. Okay. Alright, so this had thickened a bit. You can see it here. So to kind of check when it's done, just hold the spoon up and it should have a slower drip. Once it cools on a spoon, it'll turn more into a syrup or a jam. That's when it's ready. And to finish that We're going to add a little bit of zest. Just a tiny bit, just about a pinch will do. And you're going to just a few drops of lemon juice. Into that, we'll just add some of the fresh blueberries. This as the compote, and then I'll just mix into the batch I made previously. That you can set aside. Okay. Great. So just finish the last bit of parsley. Oh, definitely, yeah. I'd say just the cooking time will vary, and the lemon, I would say adjust it. Lemon goes very well with blueberries, but that's more just for your own taste. But yes, chop up the fruit depending on what size it is. Other berries work very well. If you're using something like a stone fruit, like peaches, work very well too. Just peel the skin if it's the type with a fuzzy, with like the fuzzy skin. Peel that first before you chop it up. I've noticed that peaches with the fuzzy skin, they'll oxidize, and then the compote, once you make it, it'll have like a orangey brown color instead of a bright, like vibrant yellow orange. But keep the same process, chop it up into even pieces, and then cook it down with the sugar and the water. If they're the serrated ones, you don't need to sharpen them. You technically could, but it's just a lot of time and effort that's going to go into it. I've seen some types that don't have the serrated edge, they're more smooth like this. Those you could sharpen, but usually you don't need to. Same with the paring knives, like this one. It has a serrated edge. These ones are relatively inexpensive, so once it meets the end of its life, you technically can just throw it out. But these last a very long time. I've had the same paring knife for 4 years at this point, and it still doesn't need to be sharpened. Okay. So parsley's done, nice and finely chopped. We'll go into the tomato next. So for this I use the paring knife. You can take the core out here. So you can either use these like the garden style tomatoes or Roma tomatoes.